Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to today's KLF Bhava Samvad. So, this one is really special because today we have the session on the book Mahagatha 100 Tales from the Puranas by author and screenwriter Satyarth Naik with Kaveri Bamzai, who is a journalist, author, and film critic. Published by HarperCollins, India, Mahagatha is an epic collection of 100 greatest mythological stories from the ancient Puranas of Hinduism, from Satya Yuga to Kali Yuga, in a unique chronological format. I would request our esteemed speakers for today to begin with the session. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Satyat, real pleasure to be here with you. This is the wonderful book that you sent me, and it's really quite a delight. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. And I can see that
Thank you
it's
for
been
agreeing to do this. Thank you for
not at
agreeing to
all.
do this.
It's been a real labor of love, Satyat. I can see, the
Yeah.
way you pick the stories as well, and each story is so fascinating. It just draws you in. So my first question, obviously, is that what drew you to the Puranas? Because we've now, fortunately, with so much of excavation of
Yeah.
history going
Yeah.
on, at least we now know the many versions of the Mahabharata, the many versions
Yes.
of Ramayana. But what drew you to the Puranas?
Right. So, Kaveri, I think like all Indians, I think I also grew up listening to these stories. I think we belong to that generation where we had grandfathers and grandmothers who would
Right,
narrate these stories to us. So, my grandfather was that person in my life. He
right,
was an extremely well-read man, and he knew a lot of these stories. So I remember sitting and listening. So for me, it was a wonderful process of osmosis. Just sitting and absorbing all those fascinating legends and myths and all that he would narrate to
right.
me. I think that desire, that curiosity, that love for the Puranas really comes from there. That I think is really the
Yeah,
core.
take us back a little, Satyat, in a little bit of
Yeah,
detail to the time with your grandfather. What did he do? Where was it? And do you
sure.
recall those moments in
So this
greater
was in
detail?
Yeah, so this was in Orissa. In fact, I spent the first 5 years of my life with my grandparents and not
Right.
with my parents. So because my dad had just entered the government job, and they
Okay.
wanted, and I was supposed to, and I was apparently a premature child. So they
Okay.
wanted, and so they wanted that, like a more secure environment for me. So
Right.
they said it would be in my best interest to just plonk me with my grandparents for a while they continued moving around and trying to settle down in their job. So the first 5 years of my life are with my grandparents, and I think those are extremely precious years of my life. This was in Cuttack, in Orissa, where I
Right.
grew up. So those 5 years. So that's why those memories are very, very deep rooted. And like I said, my grandfather, he was also a government servant, but he
Right.
had a love for literature. He was a very
Right.
well-read man, and he
Mhm.
loved reading. He loved, anything to do with literature, culture. That really was some. He was very strongly attached to that. Of course, a lot of it was regional literature and regional
Right.
regional culture. So I think that he really instilled in me the love for literature, for the written word, for the love for books. So he opened the world of literature for me in many ways. And I remember sitting on his lap and listening to these stories. He would tell me Odia songs, Odia poems, Odia lyrics, which a lot of it I still remember. So I think my
Right.
grounding really, really, really comes from that. And then, of course, like I said, the Puranas were a big part of his narrative because he also had grown up listening to the same stories. So that I think so. The desire to then explore this world of Puranas, this universe of Puranas, to find if there are more stories that one is not aware of. That I think so. The desire came from there, and then it led me to explore this world. And when I found that there were lot many stories that one could actually, love to know, that's when the idea came of putting them all together in a book. So that's how the journey really began.
So that it's very interesting. A lot of us have had the same kind of, a bit of a dichotomy. At
Yeah.
home, there are stories that we listen to. We're not sure, are they mythology, are they history?
Yes.
And then you come to an education system which actually shuts out all this. And, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
not to say that we should not learn about Western
Sure.
literature, but so there's a bit of a dichotomy there. So
Yeah.
how was there a time when you had sort of lost touch with your roots and then you sort of rediscovered them, or was it always a part of you and you wondered why you didn't see more representation of this everywhere?
No, I think it would be the latter. I think I was definitely a lot more connected, in
Right.
that sense, because, like I said, and my grandparents remained a very important inspiration, a very important source of strength for me for lot many years, even after I left them and I came and lived with my parents after that. So that influence always remained, and that love for literature always remained. So even if my reading horizons broadened, in so many ways, but then I
Right.
think that innate love for what was a part of the Indian soil, what was a part of Indian culture,
Right.
what was our heritage, our what had our great ancestors written. So those
Hmm.
ancient texts always fascinated. I think I had a love for history. I love what is ancient. I love what has been done and how it has been done and what was that time period when that was done. I think that for me, I always get fascinated by history, by mythology. I think it somewhere calls out to the inner child within me. I think, so these spectacles, these the lofty imagination of these writers, I think that always fascinated me. Even now, for example, if you ask me what are my favorite genres, mytho and history are right there at the very top. So I think I was always fascinated with mytho and with history, and so that I think that love always remained. So I never really lost touch with that. But of course, the horizons broadened, and then of course now I'm hopefully a part of that very horizon in creating something out of that.
So when you went back to rediscovering this in a way, Satya,
Yeah,
what were the most surprising things for you?
right. I think one of the most fascinating things that I discovered was how these Puranas actually, they inhabit this very gloriously gray zone. How
Yeah.
everything is not black and white. That for me was very fascinating. That because one had, like you said, one had grown up on the Western system of education where you had very clear binaries. You knew there
Right.
was a heaven and there was a hell. There was God and there was devil. There was
But that's
evil and
not
there was
our
good.
tradition. Our
But that is
tradition
not
is,
our tradition.
yeah.
Yeah, when I entered our tradition with that mindset, suddenly I was challenged because I realized that our Brahmanda is so much more complex that you
Yeah.
cannot box anything so neatly as good and bad, as as evil and whatever. In fact, the word evil doesn't even exist in our ancient
Right.
writings because
Right.
nothing is termed evil. It is ultimately about your actions, about your
Right.
karma, and then your karma phala. So that for me
Right.
was a huge learning. That complexity was a huge learning. And if you see the stories also in Mahagatha, you'll realize how everybody and everything is so gray. We talk
Yeah.
about 50 shades of gray. We have like a million shades of gray in our
Right.
Puranas. Yeah, I mean, look at these stories. For example, I mean, Vishnu, when he takes birth as Ram in Treta Yuga,
Hmm.
he is the
Yeah.
upholder. He
Right.
upholds every rule, every norm. The same Vishnu, when he is Krishna in Dwapar Yuga, he is the uprooter. He is uprooting. He is questioning everything, every norm, and because he believes in evolution, and that is how it will come. You have stories where you have gods, devas. They behave like asuras. They are
Yeah.
more, the way their actions are a lot more brutal than that of gods. And you have asuras like Bali, like Bala. They
Yeah.
actually behave in a more virtuous manner. Things like
Right.
that. So even the Kshir Sagar for me is like the ultimate symbol that the when the churning happens of the
Yeah.
ocean of the milk, first you get halahal and then you get amrit. So the same place gives you halahal and amrit. So
Right.
that I think, so that is what really is fascinating about your Brahmanda, and what I think is you cannot label anything that neatly. So that was a big eye opener for me.
Which is more in tune with the Mahabharata, isn't it? Because even in the
Yeah,
Mahabharata,
absolutely.
you have the same kind of sense of no one being perfect.
Very true, very true, very true. Mahabharata, I think, except Krishna, because he, of course, is God.
Yeah.
Every other character is a flawed character. Every other
Yeah.
character is a human character. Like even Ramayana, for example, Ram and Sita are ideal figures. You
Yes.
cannot find flaws in them. But by the time, also because remember, the Mahabharata came much later after Ramayana, so the shift of
Yeah.
values had happened. I mean, if it's fascinating that you talk about these two epics, because in Ramayana, the villain is the outsider. Ravan, who
Yeah.
is the outsider, he is the villain. By the time you come to Mahabharata, the villains are inside your home. Your own
Exactly.
people have become your enemies. So
Right.
that is how the values have shifted, and that is how, which is why the values of Ram are different, values of Krishna are different, because the yugas are
Right.
so different and things
Right.
have changed dramatically. Now the Puranas were written much later after Mahabharata happened, which is why you
Right.
find even gray zones even there, because that is
Right.
how the world was being perceived at that point of time.
So, isn't it fascinating, Satya, that you had so much complexity, which
Yeah,
now, as we rediscover our gods and goddesses and our, the characters in our stories and our myths, we
yeah,
want to put them in boxes. We want to
yeah,
say, okay, Ravan was evil. Ravan was not. I
yeah,
mean, he was a great
yeah,
man.
yeah, yeah,
He may have been
exactly.
flawed and he had a enormous ego, obviously.
Yeah,
Ram was not always ideal. But
yeah,
when we come to this yug, we
yeah.
want to again go back, perhaps because I don't know, is it our Western influence? What is it that is making us put all these people into boxes again, which is so sad?
Yeah. Kaveri, I think that is happening a lot more in television than in actual writing. Because if you see the kind of literature that we are
No,
producing today,
in society also, Satya, when you
okay.
talk about Maryada Purushottam, for
Yeah,
instance,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
you
yeah,
have or the Ram Raj. These are all perceived
yeah.
as very idealistic societies, which in a
Right.
way now we want to reintroduce into our
Sure, sure,
social
sure.
context.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I think that again, I think is one part of society which kind of is holding on to the past, and which wants to glorify the past, and which is not ready
But
to
a
see that the
particular
past.
kind of past. Our past
Yes,
actually was not like
yeah.
this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, their defense is that what we see is that we see what was great in the past, and we are only
Yeah,
focusing on that, which is
right.
wonderful, because there was a lot of it that was absolutely marvelous if you look at our history. But like you said, a lot of it was not exactly that whitewash, but it probably is not being highlighted. So I agree with you there. There is a section that kind of whitewashes the past and talks about only the glorious aspects of it. Also, what is dangerous is that when you also pit your society against other societies, and you start
Yeah,
claiming that
yeah,
that ours was better, and when those comparisons happen, that again is extremely dangerous. Also,
right.
there's this need to adhere to one single grand narrative that I feel is very, very problematic. When you say that only one narrative should exist in our country, and every other narrative is probably not as important, or not as credible. That I feel, if you see the Puranas, I mean, a very vivid imagery in the Puranas is that of the Ardhanarishwara.
Yes,
You have the male principle and the female principle, and both
yeah,
are vital. You need
right.
to have both to create.
Which is actually
For
a
me,
cover.
yeah, which is also on the cover, exactly.
Yeah,
But having read the Puranas in such detail, while of course the primary symbol is that of a male and a female, I kind of see a more secondary and even probably a more tertiary symbolism there. That what this visual is telling us is that if there is one narrative, there also needs to be a counter narrative. There has to be an
absolutely.
opposite narrative.
Yeah,
Only when there are two narratives can there be a synthesis, and then you can have a third narrative, which then brings something new, and then you evolve. So
right.
that is what, like you pointed out, that if this reluctance to accept a counter narrative, this reluctance to allow an opposite narrative also to exist, that plurality is what the Puranas celebrated. That
Yeah,
plurality somewhere is today being definitely, it is definitely being questioned, and being trying to in so many ways being trying to be stifled. But I think that is where the Puranas also need to play an important role to remind us that the existence of all these voices is extremely important to create a society that can then evolve. Otherwise, we'll stagnate if we stick to one particular point.
absolutely. Let's develop that idea a little more, Satyat, and
Yeah,
talk about the plurality that you encounter, that we
yeah,
encounter in the Puranas.
yeah.
Let's talk a little more about it.
Sure. So, like I said, there are so many stories,
Yeah,
where you have where nothing, like I said, nothing is black and white. I mean,
right.
there is a story, for example, where a cow is cursed, and
Hmm.
then there are stories where a snake is blessed. Now, that for me was a shocker, because as
Right.
Hindus, you obviously thought that the cow is celebrated in Purana as
Yeah,
the Kamdhenu, which is the giver of everything, and yet
yeah,
you also have stories where Sita actually curses a cow because the
yeah,
cow utters a lie. And then you have Krishna, who then blesses a snake, which is Kalia, the snake. And then you read why that happened, what the story entails. So these
Right.
things are extremely fascinating. When you come across those kind of things, then you realize that your own preconceived notions about so many things, about Hinduism, about culture, it actually was very narrow. And then suddenly you feel so much more challenged in terms of your knowledge and a lot of that. So I think the Puranas really opened my world that ways, in terms of even the way the women are portrayed,
I
in
was
the
about to
Puranas.
come to that, Satya,
Yeah,
because that is the underlying theme of one of the underlying themes of the way you've selected the stories as well.
yeah,
The women are so diverse and
yes.
always end up saving the universe, actually.
Exactly. That again was a big eye opener. How
Yeah,
the Puranas celebrate the Devi. Like today
yeah,
we talk about gender parity and we make such a big noise about social
yeah,
equality of the Puranas celebrated that. They celebrated Shakti, the principle of Shakti, the principle
right.
of Devi, like the story of Swaha, which I've been narrating everywhere, and people have just loved that story.
Yeah. Why
Where
don't you narrate it here as well?
Sure, absolutely, because it's a short story, so and so
Yeah,
I think it won't take too much of time. So basically, it happens one day where all the gods turn up before Brahma, and they're all
yeah,
starving, and they
yeah,
say, we are just famished and we're about to die. And Brahma says, but how's that possible? I have created a system where whenever there are yajnas and havans on earth, and
yeah,
humans make offerings in the fire, those
yeah,
offerings will reach you. That is your
right,
food, and then you in turn will give the humans blessings. So that is the kind of symbiosis I have created. So how can you not be feeding yourselves? And then they
right,
all look at Agni, and poor Agni says, I have no idea, but I just don't seem to have the agency to be
yeah,
able to transfer those offerings from earth up here to heaven. I just don't have the agency. And then everybody is wondering, now what do we do? Because this is a question of survival. How will the
right,
god survive? And then Brahma creates a goddess, and he says that this goddess will have that power. She will be the conduit between heaven and earth, and she will provide Agni the agency through which that transfer can happen. And Brahma names the goddess Swaha, and
right,
lays down a cardinal rule that from now on, in every yajna, in every havan, whenever a mantra is uttered, that mantra has to end with the word Swaha, which is
Swaha,
what we have all encountered. Whenever we've been to any yajna, it is always so sa swaha. That
right,
swaha always has to be there. And Brahma made that rule: unless swaha is uttered, that though that havish, that offering will not reach the gods. So how
right,
wonderful is that, to know that here,
absolutely.
you a woman had to be created to keep the poor gods alive. And that keeps happening throughout the stories in Mahagatha. If there is a Mahishasura, you
A
have to have
woman
a
has
Durga.
to, again, you need a woman.
Exactly. You need a woman. In fact, Mahishasura's blessing was that he had asked for a boon, that I
Yeah,
can be killed by anything and anybody on earth except a woman.
except,
Because he
yeah,
felt, yeah, because he felt a woman has no power before me. What can a woman do to me? And
he had
that
no
proved to be his.
clue what was coming.
Exactly, and that proved to be his nemesis. The fact that
Yeah,
he had said woman. Or when you have a Rakta Bija, you have to have a Kali, because only
yeah,
Kali can drink his blood and then reduce him to nothingness.
right.
So there are so many stories like that where you have to have. Even if you read stories of Sangya and Tara,
Mhm.
both these ladies, they very quietly abandon their husbands
Yeah,
because they don't find physical satisfaction, and the Puranas don't judge these women.
yeah,
They're never questioned. In fact, it is the men who are found wanting, and they
right,
come back and they say, we are sorry, it was
right,
definitely our fault, and we never realized it all our lives that we were the ones who were actually lacking. so
right.
so so a lot of these stories, the way the women are celebrated. Of course, you also have stories where the concept of purity is also
Yeah,
celebrated. Let's
yeah,
also not forget that aspect of the Puranas.
yeah,
So for example, if there's the story of Brinda, who loses her chastity, then she burns herself because she feels
yeah,
that everything is lost. So the concept of even in Tara's story, the concept of the purity of the body of a wife is debated by the gods. And when
right.
she produces a child out of wedlock,
Yeah,
who is the father, that is debated. So even so, it's not everything is not hunky dory in the Puranas as well, but
yeah,
a lot of it also talks about the importance. I think the best story to really illuminate this is that of Bhringi. Bhringi was a huge
yeah,
devotee of Shiva. So
yeah,
Bhringi comes and one day tells Shiva that I really want to go around you 3 times. And Shiva says, please do. I'll be more than happy. You're a devotee.
yeah,
And he's about to start, and Parvati comes and sits next to Shiva and says, you cannot encircle him. If you want to
Yeah.
really worship Brahmanda, it has to be Shiva and Shakti both together.
Right.
No, you cannot only worship Shiva and ignore Shakti. So so stories like that, where the woman was always at the equal footing, at times
Right.
even on a higher footing. That I think really, really what the Mahagatha stories for me are such a source of joy. And I think the readers, the kind of reviews I'm getting, that is what they're loving as well. These
Yeah.
a part of these kind of stories. Yeah,
Right. The other thing, Satya, because we come to that with Adi Shankaracharya, the idea of samvad, debate. Everything
yeah,
has to
yeah,
be a dialogue. Nothing is set in stone. You argue
yes,
your case. Do you find that in the Puranas as well? There's a lot of debate that's going on. I find that in
absolutely.
the stories as well.
Absolutely. That, like I said, even the Ardhanarishvara, when I'm talking about the
Yeah,
two narratives, it is actually that, that if there is Vad, then there also has to be Vivad. Only when there is
exactly.
Vad and Vivad can there be Samvad. So
Right.
that is definitely, and you have a lot of stories where dialogue, what the discussion, that is very, very important. Like there is a story where where Vishnu and Shiv come together and they are
Mm,
talking about a certain situation, and you can
mm,
see that Vishnu, it is the story of Vrinda, where Vishnu knows that he has to defile Vrinda because
mm.
that is what is destined. Because Vrinda's husband, who is a demon, he gets all his power from Vrinda's chastity. So Vishnu
Right.
needs to defile Vrinda. And Vishnu
Right.
has been knowing that for many years. And yet, when the time comes for him to actually commit the act, he is in a sense of moral conflict. And
Mm,
Shiva comes, and the dialogue that happens, the debate that happens, it's beautiful, it's emotional. And Shiva tells him that, you always knew that you had to do this. It was not something that you never knew. And Vishnu says, of course, I know that. And yet she is my biggest devotee. How do I go through with this? So the way the two gods talk this out. And then ultimately the final dialogue that Shiva says is that, are we really the masters of Brahmanda, or are we simply serving Brahmanda?
mm,
Because you realize that even gods, our so-called trinity of gods, even they are bound by rules, by the
mm.
universe, by what has to be done. Ultimately, it is about time, and time really is the master, and even gods have to obey. That again, Kaveri, is a very fascinating thing about the
Yeah.
Puranas, that gods and humans are never judged differently. There are no
Right.
different rules. The rules are the same whether you're a human or you are divine. Like when Shiva, for example, beheads Brahma, that story,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
immediately now, while what he does is there is a just reason for why he had to behead Brahma, and yet this action is seen as Brahma Hatya, because
Right.
Brahma's one head has been chopped off. So
Right.
Shiva is then cursed to go around the universe looking for salvation. And he does
Right.
that. He wanders the entire universe.
Right.
Brahma's skull gets attached to his hand as a sign, as a symbol of his guilt. I mean,
Right.
imagine Mahadev, the Devon ka
Yeah.
Dev, Mahadev is wandering through the
Exactly.
universe
Yeah.
looking for absolution,
Yeah.
and then finally he comes to a place where the skull drops from his hand, and he knows that he has been purged. That place becomes Kashi or Varanasi,
Right.
which is
Right.
where now people go. So stories like this, and you realize that how wonderfully democratic the world is, and how fair the world is. That the same rules apply for everybody.
Yeah.
Human, divine doesn't matter, and that is what, when, if Krishna is to be killed by Jara, there is a
Yeah.
reason. And when Jara comes and folds his hand in terror and says, I'm so sorry, I have killed Krishna, I will burn in hell. Krishna
Yeah.
says, you will not, you will
Yeah.
not. Because what you have done is you have completed a cycle that had
Yeah.
begun way back in Treta Yoga, and I was here waiting for you to come and hit
Right.
me with the arrow.
Right.
And then, so stories like this, I mean, it's just fascinating to read this stuff.
And also, Satya, the idea of our gods,
Yeah, yeah,
they are so personal to us. I mean, there is
yes,
no distance in a way. Of course, we
yeah,
pray to them, but they are also part of our lives. They are us
yeah,
in a way,
absolutely, yeah, yeah.
they're almost domesticated.
Oh yeah,
And,
yeah, yeah.
you know,
Very true.
so talk a little about that relationship that we have with our gods.
No, you're true. In fact, domestication, I think, really applies the most to Shiv. If you see
Yeah,
Shiva, his earlier form, that of Rudra, when he first is kind of emerges out of the Parabrahman
yeah,
as the third aspect of the Trinity, he is
right,
this ferocious form, and that is when he's Shiv. who only meditates and who only believes in meditation, who cannot take part in the creation of the universe, because that is not something he even understands. He
Yeah.
is the ultimate yogi. So
Right.
and for him, yoga is really what defines everything. So
Right.
when the yogi then becomes the bhogi, when
Yeah.
Shiv becomes Shankar, is when
Yeah.
Parvati domesticates Shiva. That
Right.
happens after. So when Shiv is with Sati, he's still very much, even though he has become a husband and a householder, but he's
Yeah.
still very much, that relationship also has a lot of austerity in the way it is really created in the
Yeah.
Puranas. It is, and then of course Sati dies, and then Shiva
Yeah.
again goes back into mourning, and then again he's again the yogi. But when Parvati comes, and when Shiva finally, with a lot of difficulty, accepts Parvati all over again, and he agrees to once again be a householder, once again, in a way, succumb to Maya, succumb to being a
Yeah.
bhogi again, and
Yeah.
to have a family around him. That is when you realize suddenly that that also has a repercussion, because it's only when Shiva's seed comes to fruition and he has a son, then an asur called Taraka can be killed. So
Right.
even domesticating a god had repercussions. There was a need why Shiva had to be domesticated, why he had to have a Ganesh and a Kartik who can then further on take on his legacy, and then do more good for the world and the universe. I think that
Right.
the core principle of the Puranas is always about Jag Kalyan. It is always
Right.
about doing greater good for humanity, and
Right.
gods have to do what is required of them. So if it requires a yogi to become a bhogi, if it requires Shiva to become Shankar,
Right.
to an ascetic to become a householder, you have to do that. You have no choice in that matter.
Right. Let's talk about Brahma, the most ignored of the Trinity.
Yeah, yeah.
How did you sort of rediscover him through your work?
You're very right. Poor Brahma kind of always gets a raw deal. He is
Yeah.
not even worshipped across India, and
No, I
that
mean,
there are
very
hardly
rarely.
temples.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very rarely. I think Pushkar, they say, is the only temple in India which kind of
That's
has
right.
a which worships Brahma. I
Whereas
think I
Vishnu
think
and Shiv have,
yes. Have
legions of devotees.
yes, kind of monopolize everything. I think see, it also has to do with a lot of the fact that ultimately the Vaishnav sect and the Shaiv sect, they became so strong that they
Yeah.
didn't really leave the place for any other court to really kind of prosper. See, the Puranas also are not a sacrosanct text in that relation. While the Puranas were kind of created at a particular time period, but they were then drafted and redrafted over centuries. So even within the Puranas there are divisions. So if there are, I mean, there are supposed to be 18 Puranas, right? Out of that, some are dedicated to Vishnu, some
Mm,
dedicated to Shiva. So
mm,
that happened because, like I said, those sectarian politics started creeping in, and those who drafted those Puranas, and depended on whom were they worshipping. So the Vishnu Bhakts created their own Puranas. So if it's a
mm,
Padma Puran, or if it's a, if it's a Varaha Puran, or if it's a Kurma Puran, or a Bhagavad Puran, these are Vishnu Puranas. They
mm.
celebrate Vishnu. Then you have Shiv Puran, you have Linga Puran. They are talking about Shiva. So that is how the dichotomy kind of created. Though the values, the wisdom remains the same, they
Right.
might say the same story in different ways. There are different versions of the same story. The wisdom remains the same. The core values that they want to impart, that remains the same. So in that, I think somewhere in that drafting and redrafting and the sectarian politics and all of that, Brahma kind of lost out. So there are very few Puranas that talk about Brahma, but Brahma will of course always remain the creator.
Mm,
That is something that is there. And then there are stories like, how he also, I think, stories where he's supposed to have lied, which is what
mm.
led him to be kind of banned from being worshipped.
Yeah.
It could also be manufactured, for all you know, that maybe
Yeah.
the Vishnus and the Shiva sects, they created that story where in either story Brahma lies, and
Yeah.
then he is supposed to be yeah, whatever. So that has happened. And But ultimately, I think what is fascinating about Brahma is also the fact that he embodies the Rajas guna, which is about creation.
Right.
If Shiv embodies the Tamas guna, Vishnu
Yeah.
the Sattvic guna, Brahma embodies the Rajas guna, and that is about creation, about creativity, about the
Yeah.
need to just create something that can sustain. So that creative force will always be Brahma. So that also, the fact that the Vedas emerged from the Brahma. So then
Mm,
that way he is the progenitor of the Vedas. That the four mouths gave us the four Vedas. So things
mm.
like that glorify him in many ways. But overall, in the overall scheme of things, definitely you will not find much literature or that much of worshipping happening for Brahma, unfortunately. Yeah.
Right. So, how did you, choose these stories? How many are there? Thousands, I'm sure. And how did you narrow down on these?
When I made the first
Because
list
it's
of
all a
stories.
political act, isn't it? Ultimately, everything we do is political in the sense that,
Yeah,
there's a
yeah,
particular
yeah.
reason why this was chosen or that was chosen. So, how
Sure,
did you
sure,
do it?
sure. See, so like I said, when I first made the list after going through all the Puranas, my first list was around 300 stories. That is what I
Wow.
remember, the original list. And then I had to narrow that down to 100. I was very sure it
And
had to be
you read
100
them in
stories.
English, you read them in what
English,
language?
no, in
Okay.
English, because thankfully there were translations available
What
that I could
translation did
read.
you refer to?
So these are like, first of all, there's a person called B.K. Chaturvedi who has
Hmm.
translated a lot of these Puranas into very readable texts.
Right.
So that for me was a big resource because then I could get all the Puranas and read. Also, what he focuses on are really the most interesting parts of the Puranas and not the
Hmm.
entire Purana per
Hmm.
se. So for me, it made my job a lot more easier. So that was the primary source. So once the 300 stories were there, for me, I'll tell you, there was a criteria. There was a three-pronged criteria. First of
Hmm.
all, the basic criteria was how interesting is the story,
Hmm.
how fascinating is the tale in itself, that when I read it, do I feel an enormous sense of joy. So that
Hmm.
was the most important criteria for me. Secondly, who are the characters involved, who are the gods involved,
Hmm.
is it about demons, asuras, who are the personages that story is talking about, that
Hmm.
was very important for me as well. And thirdly, if if there is a particular story that was unknown and deserved a wider audience, so that again was very important for me. So if this is a story that is obscure, that not many people know about, these are not about gods and goddesses but about probably human characters, and yet they're imparting a very interesting moral or a very interesting thought, and it
Hmm.
deserved a wider audience, then that has found place in the book. So while you will encounter a lot of the stories are stories that because of course you needed to have them as well, because those are really important vital points in the narrative. Like if I
Yeah.
don't put the story of the Sagar Manthan, I cannot
Yeah.
tell you the story of Vinita and Kadru that happens after that. So while
Hmm.
those important stories are there are many that are unknown that I've encountered for the very first time, and that I think you'll also find a lot of joy in reading that as well.
So it was a labor of what? How many years?
5 years actually, from reading to getting it published. It took about 5 years because,
Right.
like I said, there are 36 Puranas. 18
Yeah.
Mahapuranas, 18 Upapuranas, so 36 Puranas. So it needed that much time, and I also wanted to really respect the material to give it that
Yeah.
kind of reverence, because this is ultimately about our heritage, about our culture, about
Yeah.
such a vital part of who we are as Indians. And if I'm representing this for for generations that who would hopefully go on to read these tales, I wanted to nurture them to really marinate in this universe of the Puranas and not rush through what anything, and then take my time and ultimately create this book. So I'm glad it took 5 years, but I think it's been worth the while.
Yeah. What has the reception been like? Talk a bit about that.
No, actually the reception has been really, really great. I've been chatting with readers. They have been texting me and sending me
Yeah.
messages, and it's very heartwarming to see how much love the book is getting. And what is the best part is that that the book is actually being loved by across generations. So
Yeah.
that for me is what I was actually intending, and that has been happening. Like this one lady, she messaged me the other day. She said that she's reading the book, the stories to her mother. Her mother unfortunately has gone blind and she can't see,
Oh,
and the lady told me that, as a child, I remember my mother narrating me stories. Now I'm doing the same to her.
wow. How
Thankfully,
lovely. Yeah.
because of your book. I mean, that's such a precious emotion to share. I
Yeah.
mean, thank you for letting me know. Or I have a father who just told me that I want my kids to read this book, when they read a certain age. So I think
Right.
the fact that it is actually finding a way in the hearts of both generations, that for
Yeah.
me is a huge high. So yeah, so
Right.
very happy
And
about that.
yeah, and I noticed you had a blurb from Anand Neelakantan too, who again is
Yes.
a marvelous storyteller.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
so,
yeah,
so really, there is this world out there that there's so much more to discover. I mean, the deeper you go into it, the more there is. And
yeah.
you are now also working on the Mahabharata. So, what is it like, living in this wonderful universe where people are, accepted for who they are. Uh,
Yeah.
they are often, yeah, they're flawed, they're imperfect, but they're seen for who they are and accepted. And then you come to real life where it isn't so. Sometimes, do you want to
Yeah.
just retreat into
Oh,
history and
absolutely.
stay
Oh,
there?
yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So I totally do. In fact, like you said, it's a wonderful world, and also to kind of you might not agree with many things because of course a lot of things also are there, but I think overall it was like a world where you could be yourself. Like for
Yeah,
example, I mean, look at the story of Budh, for example. Where he is born of Tara and Chandra out of wedlock,
right,
and so Tara's husband curses Budh that when he is born, he'll
yeah,
neither be a male nor a female, and
right,
he is born of neuter gender. And
right,
when he looks at his mother and says, now what do I do? How do I go on with my life? The mother just says, you just be, life will find you.
yeah,
And then he finds a person called Ela who also has been cursed that you will remain male for 1 month and then you'll become female for another
right,
month. So you will keep shifting between genders, and then these so Ela and Budh come together and they create Chandravansh. So
yeah,
what a fascinating story, and also the way the kind of acceptance that you just mentioned, the
yeah,
fact that again no one is being judged here, but you are being told that no matter who you are and what kind of a person you are, you will find life, you will find your life, your mate, or whatever that you're looking for. You know, because Puranas are also symbolic in nature, a lot of it. So it might not only be about finding a soulmate, but probably just finding what the deepest desire of your heart. You'll
yeah,
get what you want ultimately, and life will be beautiful. So things like that just fill you with so much of positivity and energy.
yeah.
That this is
And
what the
hope,
Puranas talk about,
and hope, because so
and
much
hope.
now,
Yes, yes,
is, as I said, being put into boxes, and the whole
yeah,
idea of
yeah,
transitioning gender, which
yeah.
we now talk about as such a modern concept.
Yes,
It's very much there in Ela, isn't it?
exactly, exactly, exactly. So
What
so a lot
else
of it,
did
like.
you, yeah, what else did you find which sort of, struck you as being, oh my God, it's so contemporary?
I think also the concept of karma,
Yeah,
I mean the fact that Newton is supposed to have discovered this whole thing about action and reaction, but that
right,
is what our Brahmanda has been talking about ever since. So how Newtonian is our Brahmanda, that every action will have an opposite reaction, and that is
right,
what has been happening across the yugas. So which is why also the why people ask me, why have we created a linear format? Why is
yeah,
it chronological? So for me, that was important because when I read those stories, I realized that every story has a cause and effect.
yeah,
Nothing here is happening in isolation. Nothing is a random occurrence that just happens just for the sake of happening. Everything
right,
is connected to each other. There is a past, there is a future, and everything is about karma and karma phal. So
right,
if you have Ravan and Ram in Treta Yuga, there is a reason for that, and that
yeah,
reason is back in Satyug, where Vishnu had these two Dwarpals and they were cursed, and the story the knot begins there, and then the thread comes all the way down here, and then you suddenly realize that you see Ravan with different eyes, that suddenly he is not no longer that evil person that you thought he is, but you realize there is so much more complexity in the way Ravan and Ram, that relationship suddenly gets a new color. So things like that. So for me that was very fascinating to understand that complexity and then to put that in one linear narrative, so that you realize everything is connected, and if there's a knot somewhere, there is another knot somewhere else, and ultimately you realize that everything is happening in connection to each other. It's about, and that is also about your theory of relativity, where
yeah,
everything is relative to each other. So I think a
right,
lot of this, I think, sorry.
right.
Yeah.
So, Satya, who's your favorite god?
I think I have always been a Vishnu bhakt.
Right,
So yeah, yeah, yeah. I have always, though Shiv is the primary deity in my household, but I
yeah.
have always had a leaning towards Vishnu, towards Krishna. I think I'm more of a Vaishnavite in my heart than a Shaivite.
Why is that? What attracts you to Vishnu?
I think also because see Shiv also kind of remains a bit retreated from the world. He
Yeah,
kind of remains aloof. I think that for me is the problem. Vishnu is a lot more into the world, the schematics of everything. He's a more integral part of what ultimate, because Vishnu's task was preservation, Shiva's
Mm.
task was destruction. So
Right.
Shiva waits for the whole world to come to a point when he can then destroy it. But for Vishnu, it was really about creating that one cycle after the other, making sure that things remain as they are. Also, what not many people know, which I also found in the Puranas, Vishnu also has been cursed repeatedly, by
Mm.
various people. And that also happened because of his need for greater good. So whenever
Mm.
he has done something unpleasant for greater good, he has been cursed. And he has
Mm.
accepted, every time he accepts the curse with utmost humility. That I find very fascinating. So if he had to kill Kavya Mata because she was shielding the Asuras, and then Bhrigu comes and Bhrigu curses him that you killed my wife. I curse you that you will be taking birth as in various avatars on earth,
Right.
and in each avatar you will go across the same pain and pleasure that we humans go through. that
Yeah.
is that is the reason why the Dash avatar happened. And that is
Right.
why when Vishnu takes birth as Ram, he has to undergo separation from Sita,
Yeah.
because that curse has to play out. So
Right.
so while he undergoes pain, but he does it for the good of the world, because ultimately that for him, for Vishnu, greater good is all that matters. And if you come in the way and you have to be sacrificed, so be it. So that I find very, very fascinating about Vishnu.
It also explains suffering, because
Yes, yes.
suffering is something that we all find so difficult to explain, difficult to
Yeah,
understand. But
yeah, 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 yeah,
then
yeah.
we know that it's the human condition.
It is the condition. It is something that kind of, it almost seems predestined in so many ways, that
Yeah.
you have to ultimately go through. And Vishnu talks about pain, and he says, while of course pain is something that you might find difficult to deal with, but if you realize that, instead of focusing on your own private personal pain, if you make that pain as a part of a larger narrative where you see that everybody is suffering in this world,
Yeah.
and you try to find a question and answer for that, then your pain automatically gets resolved. So
Yeah.
that, I think, of course, it's easier said than done. but things like that, which
But that
ultimately they
at
just.
least explains, for
Yes.
you why, there is
Yeah,
so much
yeah,
pain and
yeah.
trauma in the world.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when Krishna stands before Gandhari and she curses him that your entire clan will be wiped out,
Plan
the
will
way
be
you have
wiped out. Yeah.
the way you have wiped out my clan, the
Yeah.
same will happen to your clan. And Krishna just says, I know, and this will happen, and I know nothing can stop it. And then when you see the destruction of the Yadav clan in the last story of the Mahagatha,
Yeah.
how, and then Krishna just sits down. So a lot of these things, they seem predestined, but they are necessary then for the world to move on, for the next cycle to come. Because also Vishnu and Krishna also talk about the fact that you cannot be attached to anything. It is
Yeah.
ultimately because every cycle has to lead to another cycle. So accept the fact that you are a part of one single cycle which will end, and then it has to make way for the new cycle to come. So once you realize that and accept that, I think life becomes a tad easier, if not more.
Absolutely wonderful to talk to you, Satyat. And I really do recommend this book to everyone. It's been a pleasure to read it, and even more to talk to you about it. Uh,
Thank you.
uh, I hope our readers and our viewers and listeners enjoy it as much as I did. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaveri, for doing this. Very, very grateful. I'm glad we met again after Bangalore, and
Yes.
hopefully we'll meet again in person, and we'll chat a lot more about books as we always
Yeah,
do.
and I look forward to your next work. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaveri. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.